Hello, welcome to part 4 of Mehron Missed the Knuckle. We've been talking about Perceval and the story of the Grail as it compares with Final Fantasy VII so far in the realms of chivalric conquest and infinite plenty of opportunity. And so now I want to talk about what I found to be the most interesting comparison between the video game and the medieval narrative, and that is pleasure. It is pleasure that defines these battles as a romance in a large way. Historically, romance has functioned as sort of the. I hope this is a correct assumption. The pop fiction of its time. Like they definitely had like strong intellectual quality, but people read them because they loved reading about adventure. They loved the moral nostalgia associated with a time long past. It's also worth mentioning at this point that chivalry never really existed as far as like an actual life's practice. Perhaps it did in a nostalgic way, but there was never a chivalric era like there was a stone era or like a bronze era. So anyway, back to pleasure. It is the pleasure of bloody battle and chivalric romance that is at the heart of the purpose of this narrative. And so that's where the infinity comes from. That's where the infinite acquisition comes from. The chivalric belief in more is fully realized in this way, and the fantastical adventures need never end until, of course, they must. This is the major flaw of the medieval romances, that they must end. This is also what puts video games in such an interesting position as the renewal of romance. As it is also in possession of a more literally programmed landscape, Final Fantasy VII and its random battle offer the player the same sort of pleasure in Perceval, but with one significant difference: interactivity. This fully realizes the idea of romance as a genre of visceral pleasure. And I can the adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words. There's something to be said for the visceral experience a video game offers, specifically as it plays into video. There is a literal adoption of the hero's perspective. The control is offered to the player over the hero's actions, choices, motions, and entire being. The interactivity of the video game takes the promise of romantic literature, that of an escape and a wish fulfilled, to its literal conclusion. In this way, video games dismantle the power structure that is inherent in the form of the written text. There is a necessary hierarchy in written text of the author's ideas and intent as superior to the reader as passive receiver of information, and in video games this is subverted by making the player not secondary but necessary, integral to the enacting of the fantasy. It could be argued that books are written to be read, but video games are taken to the literal end and that they are meant to be played. They are meant to be literally interacted with. A book exists as an idea without someone to respond to it. Except, of course, if you take the Lacanian perspective and all speech, all utterances have a call to response. However, video games enact this literally. You can make a video game, but as far as it's been programmed to be interacted with, if no one interacts with it, it does not exist, except as a concept. So this leads us to the next very interesting aspect of Final Fantasy VII as a perfection of the medieval romantic genre. After completing the story in Final Fantasy VII, I don't want to make any spoilers, but after defeating you-know-who, the player can restart the game and enact an entirely new fantasy in replaying. Choices can be made differently at the behest of the player, leading to entirely new adventures. In fact, depending on how advanced the system is, the replay function can create an entirely new experience per play. This leads me to think of games like Shenmue or Chrono Cross, in which interaction, choices, and replay value have an immense amount of power. And though I've never played it personally, Mass Effect and Fable are supposed to have these same sort of impacts regarding choice. Like certain choices you cannot go back and change, so it becomes a very strong moral imperative to think about what you're doing. In video games, then, the role of player agency is not one of passive reception, but of active, necessary participation. Its narrative progress depends on the literal manipulation of its apparatus by the player. To quote Peter Brinson, one developer of the documentary game JFK Reloaded, which some of you may have played, The player's reaction to the content, both within the game and mind, is the narrative. This is to say that video games take the concept of reader response and exacerbate it to the point of necessary existence. Therefore, the enjoyment of the experience is tantamount to its survival as a cultural text. With no sentient being to activate its potential, a game falls into an even darker hole of disuse than might a book. Like I said earlier, books exist as language on paper, which gives them a physical presence, but the physical presence of a video game is limited to a series of microchip switches, which means that they exist in a far less potent way without reader response.